Pakistan has been using sort of Chinese weaponry. It does seem like it's been a very comprehensive tactical victory for the Pakistani Air Force. It might have been a false flag operation.
A China-Pakistan axis versus a US-India axis.
So far, there's no proof that it has anything to do with Pakistan.
We have a very solid military culture that produces these tactical victories.
Strategically, Pakistan sort of got much less than it should have. There is potential for Afghanistan and Bangladesh and Pakistan to get on the same page.
The recent escalation of military hostilities between Pakistan and India resulted in some decisive tactical victories for Pakistan, despite the sheer weight of misinformation coming out of India. The downing of 5 Indian aircraft with the confident use of Chinese weaponry would have sent a signal to India that its war readiness is in question. But did Pakistan do enough to consolidate its battlefield gains? And what of the broader regional dynamics for the country, which is being bogged down by political and economic crisis? To help us understand the broader analysis, we have today Ibrahim Moiz, author of The True Story of the Taliban. He is a writer and researcher on Pakistan and Afghan affairs. Ibrahim Moiz, welcome to The Thinking Muslim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Jazakallah khair. Well, look, this conversation is overdue. There's been a number of weeks of really interesting developments between India and Pakistan. And I think you are in a very good position, inshallah, to address some of the outstanding issues of analysis that really will inform our viewers about these past few weeks. Now, as I said in the introduction, you're the author of a book, The True Story of the Taliban, which is available on Amazon and all good bookshops. And we will talk about Afghanistan as we proceed. But I want to focus firstly on what seems like a comprehensive tactical victory for the Pakistan Air Force in particular. There was this skirmish dogfight between India and Pakistan a week or so back. And the claims are that Pakistan conducted a very smooth operation and achieved a pretty decisive victory. Maybe 7 aircraft, some of them French Rafale jet fighters, were downed by the PAF, by the Pakistan Air Force. Just explain it. I mean, of course, there's a lot of exaggeration on both sides maybe, but just give us a picture of that tactical victory.
Yeah, so the Indian military conducted strikes in Pakistan, and some of them were, quite sensitive areas. So, for example, the airbase near Rawalpindi. And in response, Pakistan basically sort of had an air battle on the border with India, and they're said to have shot down a number of aircraft. And one of the reasons that this is gaining a lot of attention is because Pakistan has been using sort of Chinese weaponry, and some of these Indian weapons aircraft have been French and from other Western countries. So a lot of these sort of international powers, they look at how their weapons are performing. So because of that, there's been quite a lot of attention. But it does seem like it's been a very comprehensive sort of tactical victory for the Pakistani Air Force.
Let's talk about that, the China element of this, because a number of analysts, defense analysts, have said that this shows a victory of Chinese hardware in comparison to Western or NATO equivalents. And I've heard many Chinese commentators suggest that this was sort of a test case, right, for future conflicts. How much should we read into the China element of Pakistan's military makeup?
So I think all military analysts are sort of motivated to sort of exaggerate and play up that this next battle is the most amazing technological advance and things like that. But the Chinese. The Chinese military manufacturers, they've sort of had their weapons battle tested at no cost to themselves, right? It's been done by Pakistanis. So they're very pleased with it, obviously. And, China also has sort of been part of this sort of backrooms competition with the West, not just in weapons manufacturing, but in other things as well. So this is sort of seen, they sort of see this as another sign of, like Chinese... a Chinese ascendance, or if you want to call it that. obviously, the Pakistani Air Force, they have been using Chinese equipment for a while. Traditionally, Pakistan had sort of relied heavily on sort of Western arms manufacturers until recent decades, and with the very close relationship between China and Pakistan, and China's military manufacturing, sort of progressing a lot. Pakistan has been using Chinese weapons for at least part of their training and things like that, and obviously, as we saw in warfare as well. So this is sort of geopolitically interesting on a couple of levels. Number one, it sort of shows that the West is not the only sort of outlet to get weapons from. One reason that a lot of sort of developing countries, for lack of a better word, go to the West is because they want to buy their planes, their drones, their bombs, whatever. But now China has sort of, it's been doing it for a while, but this sort of helps confirm that China is a major competitor. On another level, it also shows that just from a local point of view, it shows that Pakistan is sort of not as reliant exclusively on Western weaponry as it had been before. It's been known for a while that Pakistan has been getting weapons from different places, but this is sort of a pretty important sort of sign that they don't necessarily need Western weaponry in order to succeed militarily. That said, it's not as if it's not that the weapons that India employed, which there were a mixture of sources. In India has a number of suppliers ranging from France to Russia and a number of others. But it's not that their weaponry was bad. I just think that the Indian rationale for the war was not sort of properly thought out. It was quite foolhardy. They sort of wanted to show that they could sort of avenge this attack that happened in Pahalgam, and they decided to sort of go in without thinking of that the other side might be able to punch back. So that sort of ended up being a bit embarrassing for them.
I mean, what does this tell us about the war readiness of the Indian military? Because of course, India spends much more on its army, on its military, than Pakistan. Yet Pakistan was able to achieve, by all accounts, by many commentators, non-Pakistani commentators, quite a decisive tactical victory.
Yeah, so I wouldn't comment like too harshly on the Indian military in this case. I think that they were given sort of a mission that was sort of not well thought out. Just go and bomb and expect that if anyone tries to hit back, it's not going to work. Basically, essentially, that's what it was. And I think it was much more of a political sort of attack than it was any intelligence-based attack or any sort
political. How so?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, political in the sense that the government wanted to sort of show itself as avenging the attack in Pahalgam, and they've been sort of beating their chests for a long time about when it comes to the Indian state in general, but including its military performance and things like that. So I think there might have been a bit of over confidence, at least from the decision makers, maybe not the military themselves, but there was definitely overconfidence, and I think they were politically complacent. They thought that they would be able to do this without getting much of a backlash, and they thought that they would have more international support than they had ended up getting.
The Americans for some time have been talking of the Indo-Pacific, and they've been sort of exaggerating or expressing India to be quite central to this region, whether it's South Asia or the Pacific region. And some American commentators have for some time spoken of building an axis against China, and India is the obvious choice because of its size of population and its ability to project power in the region. There's even discussion about a China-Pakistan axis versus a US-India axis. I mean, how much do you confirm or read into such comments?
So the United States has definitely been trying to sort of bolster India for a while against China. Not just the United States, other Western countries as well, but obviously the United States specifically.
Yeah.
I had a professor. He said that he was mentioning superpowers, and he mentioned China, the United States, and he added that the West likes to encourage India to think of itself as a superpower, but they have been sort of for geopolitical reasons, sort of bolstering India, and for probably 20 to 30 years now, sort of trying to form a more strategic sort of bulwark against China. That said, I don't think that the talk of a China-Pakistan versus versus India-American axis is that. I think it's a little bit oversimplified. Because the United States still has, occasionally strained but very strong links with the Pakistan. And in fact, Pakistan has been trying for the last 20 odd years to sort of remain close to both the United States and China. India, India has been close to the United States and Russia by contrast, just for comparison. So I wouldn't say that it's so much China, Pakistan versus India, the United States. I'd say it's more India and the United States, with both of them having a dislike of China. But India is definitely more interested in Pakistan than the United States is.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really interesting. So your argument is that Pakistan at this stage is not... is not fully in the Chinese camp, right? And doesn't want to strain relations with America. Well, let's talk about the Pakistan-America relationship. Because, of course, America did broker, at least the argument suggests that America had some part to play in the recent ceasefire between the two sides. Somewhat belatedly, but the Americans did move to broker that ceasefire. Now, there is conversation about Americans' strained relationship, especially since 2001, and Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban. I know that's your expertise and specialism, but before we get to the Taliban part, I mean, under Zia and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the relationship was pretty strong between America and Pakistan. Under Musharraf, at least at the very opening stages, Musharraf made a decision that he was going to put his lot in that relationship with America. The relationship then was strained because of bin Laden, because of the Taliban. Just characterize the last 20 years of Pakistan-America relationship and where Pakistan currently is in that.
So if it's possible, I'll just go a little bit further behind.
Please.
20 years.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where Pakistan and the United States had a strong relationship.
This is 1979.
This is basically through the 1980s.
Yeah.
They both supported the Afghan insurgency. Now the thing is that they both sort of had different aims for the Afghan insurgency as well. The United States just wanted the Soviets to leave. Pakistan wanted the Soviets to leave, but they also wanted to sort of remove the Soviet-installed Afghan government, and as well as under Zia sort of repurpose or sort of transfer some of that material into their conflict with India or into their rivalry with India.
Yeah.
So what happened was, in the very last days of Zia's government, he and the Americans sort of fell out over the 1988 Geneva Accord, which sort of said, okay, the Soviets can leave Afghanistan. They have to leave Afghanistan, but they can still give air support. They can still give weapons and this and that. And it didn't really talk about either side demilitarizing Afghanistan. So from Pakistan's point of view, or from at least Zia's point of view, this was unsatisfactory because it still left that Afghan government. Pakistan and the United States sort of diverged in the late 1980s over what they wanted from Afghanistan. So the United States, by that time, they were quite close to Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. They wanted the Soviets to leave Afghanistan, but they didn't want to sort of overthrow the Afghan government after the Soviets left. And there was no demilitarization. So the Soviets could keep sending weapons. The Pakistanis could keep sending weapons. And the United States actually became nervous because a lot of these weapons ended up going to, other actors, like, for example, Iran or, on the black market, whatever. What happened in Zia's period, and this is sort of related to Kashmir, is that a lot of this material was transferred to Kashmir, where sort of the Indian government had been manipulating elections and sort of cracking down for a while in favor of its sort of local agents. So by the late 1980s, there was an insurgency in Kashmir, which Pakistan did help militarize. Like the grievances were there. The vast majority of the organization was local, in universities or in camps or whatever within Kashmir, within the Kashmir Valley. But Pakistan did sort of give them weaponry. They sort of trained a lot of them in the Azad Kashmir side of Kashmir, which is the Pakistan governed side. So they were sort of influenced by the Soviet experience, by their experience against the Soviets, and they thought that sort of arming the Kashmiris would sort of help bleed India out, especially because India and Pakistan were already sort of in disputes over other issues as well. So during this period, the United States sort of turned against Pakistan. They didn't need them anymore after the Cold War. I think in 1990 they stopped sending any aid, and then throughout the 1990s, there were a bunch of different diplomatic and political sort of maneuvers against Pakistan by Washington. And it increasingly became seen as a rogue state. And especially because in that period, the Americans were sort of starting to see, like radical Islam as the number one enemy. And sort of this was what Pakistan had sort of been in the 1980s, right? And a lot of these groups were sort of waging jihad in the name of Islam. So to the United States in the 1990s, especially when they had a very paranoid black and white view of this stuff, this looked like, dangerous extremism and things like that. So the United States shifted closer towards India. By then, India was already liberalizing its economy. The Cold War was over. And, the Russians were no longer really a threat. India had been somewhat close to the Soviets, but a bit discreet about it during the Cold War. But after the Cold War, they increasingly tilted towards the Americans, and especially these sort of far-right sort of groups in India, such as the BJP. But even this sort of more liberal to left-leaning Congress, they started making a lot of strong links with the United States. Now, how this relates to Kashmir, obviously, first of all, it meant that Kashmir didn't really have much of a hearing in the United States. It was seen more as a counterterrorism issue by people like Bill Clinton, or even by, the Congress of that period, their Foreign Affairs Committee, things like that.
They accepted the Indian narrative.
They more or less accepted the Indian narrative. They might say, oh, maybe you should be less, maybe you should be more humane or whatever, but it was not much more than that. Essentially, they looked at it as a terrorism issue. And then at that time, there was also the war in Afghanistan, where a number of groups that Pakistan had formally backed and a number of groups that the Soviets had installed, they began to fight with each other. And, neither Pakistan nor the former foreign powers involved in Afghanistan were really able to control them. And then the Taliban sort of came out of this. And when the Taliban came, they basically took over much of Afghanistan. And in around 1995, so about a year after the Taliban emerged, Pakistan started sort of fully supporting them. By contrast, all of the other countries in the region, India, Russia, Iran, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of these countries were supporting the Taliban's opposition. And, because at that time the Taliban were sort of seen as a pariah state, they weren't recognized except by Pakistan and a couple of other countries. This also sort of fed into the Indian diplomatic narrative, right? Which is that Pakistan is sort of responsible for extremism in Afghanistan, and it's also responsible for extremism in Kashmir. And they sort of there was a very massive literature that was produced during this period by Indians and also by sort of pro-Indian Western writers as well.
Ahmed Rashid.
Ahmed Rashid, he's a Pakistani dissident, but
Yeah.
he sort of took out his irritation at the Pakistani establishment, and he sort of painted the Taliban and these groups as puppets of Pakistan. But even Ahmed Rashid, his earlier work, if you read it, he admits, this is the work before he became famous, he admits that, the Taliban aren't remote controlled by the Pakistani government or by the Pakistani military. He says that they've got a lot of different supporters within Pakistan, much more than the former Mujahideen groups did, because those groups were very, very close to, they were basically, they were almost exclusively like armed by the military rather than, sort of having different political parties or whoever supporting them. By contrast with the Taliban, they had a bunch of different parts of society, a bunch of different religious groups, a bunch of, merchant class people on the border supporting them. But obviously, these are nuances that were not really accepted in that period, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And sort of the Indian narrative won out, which was that, that Pakistan is remote controlling the Taliban. The Taliban's internal rivals also very diplomatically, they sort of created this diplomatic echo chamber, you can say. They went to the European Parliament, they went to the United States, and they sort of lobbied to say that, the Taliban are basically just created in Pakistan, and they're as if it's like a laboratory. They talked a lot about madrasas in Pakistan, although, those madrasas were also there in the 1980s and long before the Taliban came. They also, they also ignored madrasas in Afghanistan, right, in rural Afghanistan, which is where the vast majority of the Taliban came from. Right. It was basically shown as a sort of proxy force. So obviously the United States, during Clinton's term especially, they sort of accepted this narrative, and Clinton very famously after the 1998 nuclear tests by Pakistan and India, he steadily started to move towards India. Although both countries had made the tests and India had actually tested it first, Clinton sort of saw India as a more responsible actor at that time. In 1999, it was the Pakistani army sort of attacked on the Kargil front. Which was
another tactical victory, right, for Pakistan?
It started as a tactical victory. So what happened at Kargil was that the Pakistani sort of expeditionary force, they sort of stole the march on the Indians. So they occupied the sort of strategic points around Kargil, which itself is a sort of strategic location. And they were hoping that this would be like a fait accompli type of thing, which would force India to sort of submit. Now the problem was that India, reacted, and they counterattacked, and because of that, they were able to use their air force as well, which the Pakistani Air Force didn't get involved in that war, unlike this one, for example. They were already sort of getting a bad press as international aggressors, and also, the fact was that these were both two recent nuclear states, so it was seen as especially explosive. So because of that, Clinton came to see Pakistan as especially unreliable. And then after Musharraf took over, the army commander took over a few months later, it's not only unreliable, it's also a dictatorship. So, this ticks off all the sort of the villains of the villains of the liberal world order, which is, military dictator, Islamic extremism, and, aggression against international or over international borders, right?
But this all changed after 9/11, and General Musharraf, who famously put all of his eggs in probably the American basket. I mean, it seems to me that didn't he author a book, In the Line of Fire, which is named quite similar to that American Clint Eastwood movie where that security guard takes a bullet for the American president. So in other words, he was helping the Americans. And
Musharraf, he miscalculated at that time too. If this is 2001.
Yeah.
By this time, the Kashmiri insurgency, which Pakistan was backing, it had started to fragment.
Yeah.
And Musharraf's attempt to sort of force a solution in 1999, that hadn't worked. So the Kashmiris were essentially they were going in, they were raiding, and then they were coming back, and there was no political end to that. So instead of that, Musharraf had already been, even before 9/11, he had been sort of trying to make Kashmir a bilateral issue between the Indian and Pakistani governments. And when 9/11 happened, India was very, very quick to not only, support the American war in Afghanistan, which most countries did, but they also said that this should be expanded to Pakistan, right? Because they saw the Taliban as a Pakistani proxy. And what happened was that Musharraf basically, in an attempt to sort of divert this, he sort of beat the Indians to the punch, at least as he saw it, by saying, "Oh, we're not extremists. We'll join you. We'll help you." It should be noted that Musharraf did try, like for the first couple of weeks, quite hard to get the Taliban government to extradite Osama bin Laden. The Taliban didn't extradite Osama bin Laden for their own reasons. He was funding some of their, their units and stuff. So, and they were economically isolated, and they sort of didn't want to risk a rupture by kicking him out, basically. Especially because there was no guarantee that, if he was kicked out, the Americans would actually leave the Taliban alone. And especially after 9/11, the Americans had to make a stand, or they had to make a statement, rather. Like I often say to people that even if the Taliban had sort of executed bin Laden themselves in public, the Americans would have still invaded, because there was that sort of, everybody knows the atmosphere after 9/11. There was sort of this thirst for vengeance, right? Iraq didn't, obviously, as famously, Iraq didn't have anything to do with it, but they still invaded Iraq. So there was this sort of call for an American retaliation. The thing I would say is that Musharraf miscalculated in the sense that he thought that instead of letting the Americans and the Indians sandwich me, I'm going to get in the Americans' good books and thereby, sort of beat the Indians to the punch. The problem was that the way to get into the American good books was to sort of do whatever India wanted in the first place, right? But the Indians were quite annoyed at that time because they had wanted the United States to expand its war into Pakistan. So from Musharraf's point of view, that was a win. And also, initially, he didn't expect the Americans to stay that long in Afghanistan. There's a few different articles from that period which sort of show that the Pakistan government expected very naively that the Americans would leave Afghanistan by the end of 2001. And then obviously when Osama bin Laden escaped, they stayed much longer. And then Pakistan sort of tried to milk, this new status quo by sort of supporting the American extraditions and stuff of, sorry, not extraditions, what's the word? Rendering, forced disappearance, things like that. Extraordinary rendition, right?
Yeah.
Extrajudicial sort of murders and executions and abductions. India was still not satisfied with this, obviously, as I mentioned. In December 2001, which is, at the same time as the Taliban government was falling in Afghanistan, the Indian parliament in New Delhi was attacked, and India immediately blamed the same group that they've been blaming very often, which is led by Masood Azhar. This is a pretty small group, but what's notable about this group was that, number one, Masood Azhar was quite a high-profile figure. Number two, this group was mainly Pakistanis as opposed to Kashmiris. Number three, they had been close to, Masood Azhar had been released by Taliban mediation with India. So he was seen as close to the Taliban. And number four, he was also seen as close to the Pakistani state because they were believed to have helped sort of fund him in the early 2000s. So India immediately blamed this group. This group actually broke up after 9/11 because a lot of its members thought that Masood Azhar was too close to Pakistan, and Pakistan was seen now as a traitor for sort of betraying the Taliban. So the group basically splintered, and it isn't much of a group anymore. And I don't think it's been much of a group for more than 20 years now. But India sort of very conveniently blamed them. They didn't really give any proof. They convicted a man and had him executed, but there was no sort of proof that he was, in cahoots with these different groups in Pakistan. At any rate, there was sort of this standoff on the Indian-Pakistani border. And this sort of set a precedent, which we see now as well in 2025, which is that India sort of makes a claim that, that so-and-so group attacked us, and they immediately sort of mobilize against Pakistan. So that sort of starts here. Now, we see Musharraf's strategy was to sort of say, no, we're not harboring terrorists. I'm actually going to ban these militants, and I'm going to, crack down on them. He did formally ban all these groups, although, some of them just changed their names, and, they were, in practice, they were tolerated. Some of the some of the less quote unquote dangerous ones.
Yeah.
But the idea was that Musharraf diplomatically increasingly tilted towards India, and he did that because the United States was pressuring him to sort of be more of a sort of partner in the war on terrorism. So sort of writing that, he sort of acceded to the Indian wish to portray Kashmir as terrorism. He said, it's like basically, if before 2001 India had said Kashmiri militants are terrorists, Pakistan's response would have been that about Kashmiri self-determination, about freedom fighters, things like that. Musharraf himself said this before 9/11.
Yeah.
Afterwards, slowly but surely, during his talks with Indian diplomats and things like that, Musharraf basically said, well, you can't accuse us of being terrorists, of supporting terrorists, because we also think that these people are terrorists, right? So apart from a few much weakened Kashmiri groups, Pakistan sort of didn't support any more militant groups after that.
That's the situation now, because of course after the Pahalgam attack, the Indian government very quickly blamed. I mean, there was this FIR that was lodged like 10 minutes after the attack, which blamed Pakistan for being behind. I think they called it the Resistance Front, or there was an organization behind it. So what's the truth of Pakistan funding and helping these so-called militant groups?
So there are several categories of militant groups, right? And like their heyday was in the 1990s, when Pakistan was supporting just about all of them. So some of these are mainly Kashmiri groups, a few foreign fighters here and there maybe.
Yeah.
Some of these are sort of Pakistanis who've been recruited in places like Punjab, or even like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, places like that, and they sort of joined the jihad in Kashmir. This latter camp is the one that India highlights more, because it sort of shows that Kashmir is controlled by Pakistan.
Yeah.
Pakistan had supported these groups, but banned most of them in 2002. There's a couple of them. There's one called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is quite infamous in India. Yeah. This one is, to all intents and purposes, tolerated by Pakistan. They for a bunch of different reasons. I don't know if we have time to get into that, but one of the reasons is that they provide sort of social services. Another reason is that they're among the Islamic groups that did not turn against the Pakistani government after 9/11. So for these reasons, Pakistan sort of tolerates these groups.
Tolerates or arms, finances?
So there's a lot of talk that Pakistan arms and finances them, but at least with the groups that have been sort of active in Kashmir after 9/11, like the evidence suggests that Pakistan was sort of starting to sort of quietly sideline them, or sort of cut them adrift. They sort of mined that border area so that people couldn't infiltrate. In the 1990s, there was this process where they used to call it like launching, which is that you launch the militants into Kashmir, which is, they just train in Pakistan and they go into Kashmir and fight there. They stopped doing all of that in 2003, I think it was, November 2003, I think. But because of this, it's a very convenient sort of rhetorical tool, or even propaganda tool for India to use, right? They can say that, Pakistan has a long history of supporting these terrorist groups, and long history, the last time dates back to decades ago, right? A generation ago now. It's similar to how there was propaganda against Iraq in 2002, 2003, which said that Saddam Hussein has pursued nuclear weapons and things like that. And they neglected to mention that he pursued them 20 odd years earlier and had stopped. Yeah. So there was quite a lot of misinformation. It's not that Pakistan cut off the Kashmiri groups entirely, but they did cut them off militarily. And there's a few proofs of this. One recent proof was in 2019, when the main Kashmiri group, like the biggest Kashmiri group's military commander, he just defected and he joined Al-Qaeda instead. And one of his rationales was that Pakistan is sort of, playing us like a yo-yo, that they say they'll help us and they won't help us, and when push comes to shove. Pakistan has been very, very nervous since 2001 about being portrayed as a terrorist state. Right? It's much more vulnerable to these sorts of claims because of what happened in the 1990s or the 1980s
Yeah.
compared to a lot of other states. There's a few others. There's Sudan, for example, which had the exact same process. Throughout the 1990s, Sudan was portrayed by all its neighbors, as almost all its neighbors, as a source of extremism and Islamism and radicalism, and a whole bunch of countries, including Israel, including Eritrea, Ethiopia, they sort of backed the Sudani insurgency, and the United States backed them very heavily.
Yeah.
And then in 2001, the Sudani government sort of bought time for itself, the same way as Musharraf did, by basically offering to cooperate with the Americans in the war on terror and sort of share intelligence and do this and that. So you see these patterns emerging, and specifically in the Pakistani case, all the evidence, like I'm not talking about rhetoric, right? Because there's always rhetoric. All the solid evidence suggests that Pakistan stopped arming Kashmiri groups in around 2003. They did get them a very token sort of position, which is like of an observer status at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, but that doesn't really mean anything, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, this sounds, in some senses, quite negative because, of course, the Indian government is a fascistic government, and Modi has increased the securitization of the ordinary lives of Kashmiris on the so-called Indian side of the line of control. We have a situation in Kashmir where the Indian police and military are constantly engaged in horrific abuses of rights of ordinary citizens. And the impression I had until very recently was that at least there's some support coming from the Pakistani side, because of course, I would say that the Kashmiris have a right to self-defense in the face of such aggression. So the truth of it, your suggestion is that in a way, the Pakistani government has given up the fight and probably accept now this cessation line between the two sides of Kashmir.
They might, there is on and off border firing. Even now, I think there are, some shots and whatever fired on either side of the border by the militaries. But Pakistan has sort of stopped the sort of serious arming of groups that was very prevalent in 1990s, which is sort of what Indian accusations normally they sort of act like the 1990s are still continuing.
Right.
You're right, of course, that any sort of oppressed group like that does have a right to sort of self-defense. But Pakistan has sort of, they've sort of pursued a more diplomatic avenue in this, which I think is unwise, because that diplomacy is sort of based, again, on this sort of counterterrorism narrative, right? That which is what Musharraf originally said in 2004, which is that, whereas committed to India is fighting terrorism. Basically, this is almost yielding to India in not so many words that, the Kashmir issue is also part of terrorism. Where Pakistan has supported Kashmir has generally been diplomatically since 2004. Even Musharraf, I think, he was sort of a vain man. I think he overestimated himself a lot. I don't think his intention with Kashmir specifically was to abandon or to sort of throw them downriver. He did continue talking about Kashmir, for example, even after he retired, right? But he was too sort of invested in this American sort of security architecture that he had joined in 2001.
Right.
And because of that, plus because of, sort of insurgency in Western Pakistan, he wasn't willing to sort of take the sort of risks that he might have been willing to take in 1999 to 2001, which is his first 2 years, where he had been quite aggressive. Since then, Pakistani diplomats have generally been defensive on this issue, right? So, for example, this week you had a news item that now, the United States has offered to mediate between Pakistan and India. And, this news piece has been repeated a lot in the last 20 years. And it doesn't really mean anything, because it's a little bit similar to Donald Trump's diplomacy on Palestine, right? Which is that, between a few Arab princes and Israel, you can sort of cut a deal, and, the locals are sort of cut out of it entirely. So when there is this atmosphere, and Pakistan is not really, arming the Kashmiri insurgency the way it used to, there's also a loss of control. And when there's a loss of control, you see things like, for example, more random type of attacks and things like that, right? This isn't something that's exclusive to our part of the world. Even in occupied East Turkestan, right? There's no insurgency there, but every now and then you have Uyghurs who had sort of attacked, officials or policemen or even civilians in some cases, right, with knife attacks and things like that. It was quite famous about 15 years ago. And the thing is that it's not really an insurgency at that point, right? It's not a foreign-backed insurgency. It's just people who are sort of venting their frustration. This attack that took place in Pahalgam, so far there's no proof that it has anything to do with Pakistan. Yeah. There isn't even really proof that it has anything to do with Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? You just had some news articles claim that there's a group called the Resistance Front, and and that it's sort of justifying this attack. And then it sort of disappears, right?
What of the claim that many Pakistanis make and analysts make that it was a false flag operation on behalf of India?
It might have been a false flag operation because Modi, if you look at him since he's come to power, he's been sort of chomping at the bit to sort of get into a confrontation with Pakistan. He knows that the diplomatic and the international scene is loaded in his favor, so it's a very low risk strategy for him. There's not a lot that can deter him from that. So he has tried, I think this is maybe his third or fourth time to sort of make a sort of regional flare up over this. Yeah. So it is possible, but I always want to have more proof before I see these things. And I mean, it's perfectly likely that some Kashmiri did get frustrated and attacked. But it is also possible that it's a false flag. Like we know that there's other countries who've basically gotten away with genocide, right? On very, very flimsy pretexts, when their own air force is bombing festivals and then they sort of accuse the enemy of massacring them. So you don't need to have a high threshold of proof for these sorts of things, especially when you can call the opponent a terrorist. So I haven't seen any proof that this had anything to do with Pakistan, but I haven't seen any convincing proof that this was a false flag attack. It might have been, though. It's like anything is plausible at this stage.
Until now, we've talked about Pakistan in a generic sense, but of course, politically, Pakistan is really split between a civilian leadership and a military leadership. And by all accounts, I mean, everyone would suggest that actually it's a military leadership that calls for shots when it comes to foreign policy, as well as some very important economic issues and beyond that, in fact. So when we think about this military leadership, we often, and it is the case that Pakistan's military has been getting a very bad press, mostly because of Imran Khan's incarceration, but also because Pakistanis have grown weary of the corruption of the armed forces and their inability maybe to govern the country, and they see everything from a sort of military lens. And as a result, the development of Pakistan has been lagging and is economically in a very parlous state. Yet we saw the Pakistan Air Force conduct probably one of the most, excellent operations in the Muslim world. I mean, this is a high caliber Air Force. Let's square that circle for me. We've got an army that is accused of being nepotistic and corrupt and cronyistic. Yet we have a very solid military culture that produces these tactical victories.
So the Pakistani military, particularly in tactical terms, they've always been much better than they have sort of strategically. There's some people who sort of like to say that Pakistan hasn't ever won a war, which is also not correct. But even if it was correct, they have had a lot of tactical victories. Yeah. Usually it's at the strategic level where these things are lacking. And I mean, I would say even this current standoff, strategically, Pakistan sort of got much less than it should have. But they do take, training and things like that very seriously. The Air Force in particular has always had a very, very good reputation. And it, generally speaking, when people criticize military sort of practices and sort of, military interference in politics, they're usually talking about the army, or in rare cases, the Navy. But they're not usually talking about the Air Force. The Air Force has...
So there's a distinction to be made here.
They all sort of join in tandem when it comes to, to outsiders. So like outside the Pakistani military, they're sort of form a united front. But when it comes to the separate sort of chapters of the military, the army, the Air Force, etc., they do have these sort of distinct cultures and these sort of distinct norms. And it's not like these are written down, set in stone, but it's just sort of patterns that have been happening from the start. The Air Force historically has generally been the most reluctant to enter wars, but also the most capable of fighting wars. So if you look at the 1965 war, at the very outset, the Air Force did not want to get involved. And they eventually did get involved, and they played a very big role in Pakistan, sort of repelling the Indian counterattack in September 1965. In 1971, the Air Force largely stayed out of it. They were actually supposed to participate, but again, they stayed out of it. They didn't sort of get their hands dirty. In the 1980s, the Air Force performed quite well against the Soviets, who were sort of bombing the camps on the Afghan border. And then in 1999, the Air Force did not get involved in the Kargil war, and that was one reason that sort of Musharraf's strategy ultimately backfired, despite starting off well. And then again, we've seen in 2019, Pakistan's Air Force did quite well, and then finally this time around.
But you're implying some sort of like autonomy to the Air Force. I mean, Musharraf in 99 was Chief of Army Staff, yet he couldn't organize or control the Air Force.
So he basically arranged that war himself without really consulting the Navy or the Air Force or anybody else. I actually know a few people who were involved in that, so I know some of the details. But the Air Force chief, who was his former roommate from when they were young, he had expected that the Air Force chief was going to back him up because the Air Force chief had backed up the nuclear tests the previous year. The chief's name is Parvez Qureshi. But now Parvez Qureshi sort of refused to get involved in the Kargil war, and that was a big reason for the Pakistani defeat eventually, because they didn't have any air support. They were being bombarded by Indian planes, from the sky, then obviously Indian soldiers on the ground as well. So there is, I think, between sort of equal ranked sort of generals or whatever you want to call them, there is some, sometimes there's rivalries, sometimes there's partnerships, things like that. But it's not one block, right? It's only one block when it comes to outsiders. There have been several periods in Pakistani history where where the chief of one service was loyal to the government, and the chief of another service was sort of either hostile to them or sort of like critical of them. So things like these have happened quite often, and there is something of a distinction. Usually when people complain about the military, they're complaining about the army in particular, just because it's been so involved in politics. But when the army is sort of implementing military rule, it also gets the help of the other services as well, right?
As we're on the subject of army chief, I mean, Asim Munir has gained a reputation, maybe fairly or unfairly, by the opposition, the PTI in particular, Imran Khan supporters, of craving power and ruling or governing with an authoritarian stick. What is the truth of that? Like, how do you rate Asim Munir as a chief of army staff? Yeah.
As far as authoritarianism goes, he has always had this reputation as being very, very harsh, even before he sort of climbed the army ranks.
Yeah.
Doesn't tolerate dissent or criticism, things like that. He was Imran Khan's spy master too for a few months, for about 6 months. I think 6 months or 4 months. And he was actually sacked right after the 2019 standoff between Pakistan and India, where his job, among other things, was to sort of, communicate with his Indian opposite number. I'm not sure what happened there. Maybe he did something wrong. He claims that he sort of uncovered corruption in the government and things like that. I don't know if that's true or not. But definitely his reputation has taken sort of a recovery since this happened. Although, again, as the army commander, he didn't really have much to do with what went on. But now he's sort of seen as a hard man, someone not to mess with, things like that. Somebody who sort of defends Pakistan. As far as the opposition are concerned, his crackdown against them has generally been, again, very authoritarian, very authoritarian, very brutal. He has been portrayed, I think, a little bit with some exaggeration. He's been portrayed as sort of linked with other parties' leaders. He does have, I think, some familial connections with some members of the other parties, but that happens with everyone in Pakistan. There's it's a very, very there's people in families who are on totally different sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum. He does have some familial links, but I think above all, his whole thing is to sort of keep the army and, by extension himself, in power, and sort of, I think he sees it as a source of stability. And this is something that you hear very often with like autocratic leaders, right? Which is that they're sort of bringing stability and things like that. I think the main accusation that can be directed towards Asim Munir, apart from the fact that he has been quite brutal in his crackdown, but he isn't the first sort of military strongman in Pakistani history. What he has done has been sort of to exacerbate a lot of Pakistan's existing issues, and you can especially see this in the western half of the country, where he's sort of pursued a very militaristic sort of campaign against various insurgencies and things like that, and that's also linked just to the military sort of marketing itself as a force for stability. And a force for counter extremism, which that always sells well on the international stage.
Earlier on, you talked about how the Air Force won a tactical victory, but strategically it failed, or at least it fell short. Can you explain that? Like strategically, what could they have done better?
So strategically, I don't mean the Air Force per se. I mean that India took the opportunity of the Pahalgam attack to sort of unilaterally escalate and attack without bothering to give any proof, anything like that. And this is just like the latest episode in a long series of events: 2001, 2008, 2016, 2019, and now 2025. Pakistan's Air Force, sort of struck a very sharp blow. And at that time, they could have definitely done much more, especially because India had already sort of demonstrated that it could hit, targets deep in Pakistan. And when the Air Force sort of fought back against them, the military was very, very quick to accept, the American and Chinese, whatever brokered ceasefire. I think the fact that they accepted it has to do a lot, that they accepted it so quickly has to do a lot with the fact that Pakistan is still sort of internally vulnerable, right? So they just wanted to say, okay, we've won. We sort of have something that we can go home with and say, this is our achievement. And they haven't really done anything to sort of deter Modi or any other Indian government from doing this again, because, Kashmir is still sort of under the jackboot. I'm not sure if it's still the case after this Gaza thing, but it used to be until very recently the most militarized region on the planet, right? And you add to that, sort of Israeli-inspired settlers, even from other parts of India, sort of very chauvinistic, sort of Hindu extremists. And this is going to obviously provoke a backlash. And sooner or later, if a Kashmiri militant or a militant group rises, India is going to again sort of, blame Pakistan, and they're going to again unilaterally attack. There's been nothing done to deter them from that. Pakistan's tactical victory was very impressive, but their strategic stance was always defensive. They did nothing to sort of change the perimeters back to what they were before.
And is that because Pakistan doesn't have an effective political leadership, and it's really the army people who are making decisions?
So the political leadership isn't very effective. The army is mostly focused again on these sort of security and things like that, right? And again, this is both because both the United States and China, sort of the two countries that the military cares a lot about, they sort of favor this idea too, right? Of Pakistan as sort of more of a security state rather than, sort of an unpredictable or, even democratic type of state. And obviously Imran Khan was closer to China, and the current government is not as close to China. But throughout, China and the United States have both sort of been more sympathetic towards sort of security hard sort of approaches. So because of that, the army, I don't think, is willing to sacrifice this. The rationale that Modi used against them is the same rationale that they're using with Afghanistan, for example, right? Like literally until a few weeks ago, where they were sort of blaming everything bad or every attack in northwest Pakistan, and now even in southwest Pakistan and Balochistan, they're blaming it on unspecified camps in Afghanistan. It's literally the exact same script that India uses, and the army and the Pakistani army and government have been doing very well off it, right? Because they have sort of set themselves as a frontline state against the Taliban ever since Imran Khan was ousted from power. And as a frontline state, they get much more leeway than they would otherwise. So they don't want to risk this whole thing just so that, just for India. With India, they're sort of confident that the United States or some other power is going to sort of keep them in check. As long as India doesn't attack inside Pakistan like they did this time, Pakistan is not going to sort of assume an aggressive posture. Now, the reason I think that that's a mistake is because, like I mentioned, Modi has already moved the goalpost so far that after any attack, he can just attack Pakistan, that you have to move the goalpost back, right, to at least a reasonable extent.
On paper, it seems that Pakistan has got a favorable regional position. 10 years ago, India had a very close relationship with the American Afghan government, and that was at the expense of Pakistan. The Indians had a very close ties with Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh, and of course she's now been deposed from government. Is Pakistan taking advantage, or has it taken advantage of this sort of regional shift, at least when it comes to Bangladesh and Afghanistan? What is the relationship between Pakistan and these two countries?
Bangladesh's sort of long-standing government was ruled by the Awami League, which was a very, very strongly pro-Indian government. Specifically Hasina and her personal network, which was sort of the apex of the government. They were obviously overthrown last year, which Pakistan has made some diplomatic, outreaches. There have been a few differences as well, but it's generally been very positive, and relations between Pakistan and Bangladesh since then. So that was a major loss for India, and they reacted again very, very almost petulantly to the Bangladeshi government of Hasina being overthrown. With Afghanistan, it's a little bit more complex, and depending on how much time we have, I might go more into detail.
Yeah.
The Pakistan and Afghanistan relationship, it should be much better than it is. There is some bad blood because of the war on terror, but again, Pakistan, while it was complicit in the American war in Afghanistan, it didn't go nearly as far as the Americans wanted, and in fact, it in a way indirectly sheltered Taliban who were in places like Balochistan, for example. I think there was only one American airstrike in Balochistan the whole time, and the Taliban were generally safe there. But on the other hand, you also had Pakistan sort of delivering the supply lines into Afghanistan. It was one of several sort of neighboring countries that did that. And, Pakistan also made the war easier for the Americans, right? It's like classic fence sitting. So there's a lot of hostility from Afghans and from the Taliban about that. On the other hand, you have Pakistan sort of blaming the Taliban for not cracking down on the Pakistani insurgency, right? And also for taking more of a neutral stance on this rather than their sort of historical pro-Pakistan stance. Which is it's a little bit rich because until a few weeks ago, Pakistan was sort of going out of its way to sort of escalate hostility with Afghanistan, and then as soon as a crisis hit with India, they sort of demanded compliance. But at the same time, it's also true that India has been much more hostile to the Taliban, and it was a big cheerleader of the American war in Afghanistan. It didn't get directly involved simply because it wasn't next to Afghanistan. That was basically the only reason. But similar to Israel with Iraq, it didn't get involved, but it had been urging their occupation and the invasion for a long time. So there's a lot of bad blood to go around. At the moment, the major issue is that Pakistan blames the Taliban for not sort of cracking down on its insurgency. The Taliban, who are basically fighting against Daesh, they don't want to alienate the militants who are in the Pakistani insurgency. So they're sort of pussyfooting around it, and they're sort of prevaricating and things like that. And this has sort of led to a lot of hostility between the two neighbors, a lot of suspicion. Even some pro-Afghan sort of accounts have been accusing Pakistan of sheltering Daesh, which I don't think there's any proof or any indication of that. But it sort of shows this paranoia. So the best, I mean, what is good is that during this conflict, rather than sort of take a pro-India stance as the Afghan governments did during the American occupation, the current Afghan government sort of just took a neutral stance. It didn't go out of its way for Pakistan, and there's still some bad blood, obviously, but they sort of sat down with China and Pakistan and offered to mediate, and they've also sort of, in keeping with their general regional policy, they've also sort of talked to the Indians as well. Their whole thing nowadays in the last 5 years or so has been about diversifying their foreign contacts. So even countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, which had been hostile to them for a long time, they've been developing contacts with these countries. So the upshot is that Afghanistan and Pakistan at the moment, they both have a lot more diplomatic punch than they had before, especially with regards to India. Like, there is potential for Afghanistan and Bangladesh and Pakistan to get on the same page, but it's been squandered by a lot of sort of selective memory from people holding grudges, but also a lot of sort of mutually harmful behavior. Let's put it that way.
So we need more mature heads, really.
More mature heads, sort of more trust. I have an uncle who's quite close to basically all the sides concerned, because he had fought in Afghanistan during the 1980s. He knew a lot of the actors in Afghanistan. He himself is Pakistani, obviously, and he knows a few actors, quite a lot actually, of actors in Pakistan as well. But he had said to me that the biggest problem is that whichever Afghan group Pakistan supports, at any time they insist on treating them like a pawn rather than like a friend,
right,
or like a partner.
Yeah.
And then on the Afghan side as well, I would say that there's also a lot of sort of selective memory, right? Like the Taliban have sort of pardoned, Afghan commanders who had been very, very, brutal against them. They've mended their fences with other countries in the region who had been much more hostile to them than Pakistan was, even during the American occupation.
Yeah.
But they're still sort of fixating on this Pakistan issue. And I think one reason they're fixating on it is just to sort of reciprocate the sort of hostility from Pakistan in the last 3 years. So there just needs to be more mature thinking, more long-term thinking, and also thinking about what best benefits Muslims, and realizing who has been the shared enemy, or which groups have been the shared enemy of both countries over the last 20 to 30 years.
And this is India.
And, like, for example, Afghanistan gains very little by sheltering the TTP. And there's domestic reasons for doing that. But for the greater good, they could do a lot more. Pakistan, for its part, could do a lot more in Waziristan, besides just this very, very militaristic attitude, which encourages people to join insurgency, right? There could be intelligence sharing, there could even be like, border commissions, things like that. There just needs to be more long-term thinking rather than sort of fixating on little snags.
Yeah, exactly. So one final question for you, Ibrahim. I think this has been very detailed and fascinating. There's a lot of hope in Pakistan after the most recent events, and I've met Muslims from all over who have praised Pakistan for its operations, for its air force, and how it maneuvered tactically and achieved these victories. So there is a belief out there, a sincerity out there that Pakistan could be doing more for this ummah and could have a stronger position on the world stage. Yeah, Pakistan remains fairly, certainly weak as a regional actor, but also economically weak, and has a series of problems that insurmountable, it seems, that it's not able to overcome, regardless of of its political leadership. I mean, what hope do you see in Pakistan over the next 10 years?
I'm not very optimistic because for most of my lifetime, we've had this sort of pattern of infighting and also a lot of wasting good opportunities. You can go back to the 1990s, sort of wasting a geopolitically good opportunity over infighting and things like that. For a country with the nuclear arsenal, Pakistan is very, very shockingly, dependent on other people's goodwill and things like that, and sometimes overly concerned with foreign goodwill at the expense of its own interests and also its own people's sort of well-being.
Yeah.
So I'm not very optimistic. I think this is one reason that even though he had major flaws, but this is one reason that Imran Khan was very, very popular. Is because he was seen as somebody, rightly or wrongly, he was seen as somebody who could sort of move Pakistan towards that path, and he wasn't anybody's, he wasn't anybody else's man, right? He was an independent-minded person who had something of a vision for what Pakistan can and should be, even if he wasn't able to implement it. So I'm not very optimistic because to me it seems like we're going, through the same circles again and again, right? The military, the men who matter in the military, they don't seem to learn from their old mistakes. Most of the civilian politicians they're either they're concerned with their own power or their own privileges, or they're just yes men of the military. So I don't think that there's much of a vision for Pakistan. About 20, 30 years ago, there was this idea that, Pakistan is a very fanatical Muslim country, especially, people used to blame Islamization and things like that. Obviously, Ziaul Haq had a lot of issues because they often blame him, right? But Islam has been a very core part of Pakistan's identity from the start, and it's particularly Islamic sort of internationalism, right? If you look at Pakistan's sort of founding ideologues, or ideologists, they all mention, Turks, Afghans, Arabs. It's not just that you think in terms of nation state. The problem with Pakistan is today, one of the problems is that most of the people who are in positions of power, they're doing very well if they even think of the nation, right? If they even think of the state, they're doing very well. Most of them are just looking out for themselves, and those who aren't are looking at the state in a very, very hard, securitized, sort of zero-sum sort of fashion. This is something I think is true of Asim Munir, for example. As far as I know, I don't think he's personally corrupt or anything like that. But he is part of this sort of product of a very, very tunnel vision, security focused, and just very often this ceasefire is a good example, right? The ceasefire essentially came when India was sort of on the back foot. And it essentially ensured that India wouldn't lose the same sort of strategic advantage that it has over Pakistan, which is to be able to attack Pakistan whenever they want. But instead of doing anything to change that, Pakistan's government and establishment immediately sort of declared victory and started patting themselves on the on the back and congratulating themselves and getting social media and things like that to promote them. So there needs to be more long-term thinking, and there needs to be sort of a more committed and just intelligent sort of strategy for Pakistan to be able, for its politics to be able to match sort of its military potential.
Ibrahim Moiz, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time. And just a reminder, your book is The True Story of the Taliban Emirate and Insurgency 1994 to 2021. Thank you, Jazakallah khair, very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalam. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.